Imagine walking into your local supermarket with one simple expectation. You've been hearing the same headline for months. Inflation is coming down. So, naturally, you expect life to feel a little easier. You grab a shopping cart, bread, milk, eggs, coffee. Nothing fancy, just the basics. Then you look at the total. It's almost exactly what it was last month, maybe even a little higher. You pause for a second, because something doesn't add up. If inflation is falling, why aren't prices? Who's telling the truth? The economists, the politicians, or your grocery receipt? Here's the catch. The price tags aren't broken. Your wallet isn't imagining things. And contrary to what many people believe, falling inflation was never supposed to make things cheaper. In fact, if prices actually started falling across the entire economy, many of the same experts celebrating lower inflation today would become deeply worried, which sounds completely absurd. After all, who wouldn't want cheaper groceries, cheaper rent, cheaper cars, cheaper everything? Well, modern economies wouldn't. And once you understand why, you'll never hear the word inflation the same way again. Most people think inflation is the problem. It isn't, at least not by itself. The real challenge is something much stranger. How do you build an economy where millions of people keep spending? Millions of businesses keep investing? Millions of workers keep getting hired without letting prices spiral out of control? Because that's the balancing act every modern economy is trying to perform. Too much inflation, and your paycheck quietly loses its purchasing power. Too little, and businesses stop expanding, consumers stop buying, and the entire economy risks grinding to a halt. It's a little like riding a bicycle. Pedal too fast and you lose control. Stop pedaling altogether and you fall over. Inflation works in much the same way. Not because rising prices are inherently good, but because movement itself has value. Let me be clear, this isn't a story about greedy supermarkets or secret conspiracies to make your groceries more expensive. Those things can certainly influence prices from time to time, but they don't explain why almost every central bank on earth deliberately aims for inflation instead of eliminating it. That's the real mystery, because despite everything we've been taught, the people responsible for protecting the value of money are not actually trying to make prices stay the same. They're trying to make them rise, just slowly enough that most people barely notice, and that tiny difference changes everything. Let's start with the biggest misunderstanding. When people hear that inflation has fallen, they assume prices have fallen too. But those are two completely different things. Imagine you're driving down a highway. Yesterday, you were driving at 90 miles an hour. Today, you're driving at 30. You're moving much more slowly, but you're still moving forward. Inflation works exactly the same way. It doesn't measure how expensive things are. It measures how quickly they're becoming more expensive. So when inflation falls from, say, 8% to 3%, prices usually don't go down. They simply stop climbing as quickly. And that's why so many people feel like they're being told two different stories. The headlines celebrate lower inflation. Your grocery bill celebrates absolutely nothing. But there's another reason prices rarely return to where they came from. Businesses don't like lowering prices. Think about it. If a coffee shop discovers customers are still willing to pay $5 for a latte, why would it suddenly charge $4? Of course, if its competitors force it to, it might. If demand collapses, maybe. But under normal circumstances, lowering prices means accepting less revenue for selling the exact same product. Most businesses would rather avoid that. Economists sometimes call this price stickiness. I like to think of it differently. It's the price ratchet. Like tightening a zip tie. Pulling it tighter is easy. Loosening it is another story. That's why inflation leaves fingerprints long after the headlines disappear. The speed slows down, but the new price often stays exactly where it landed. Now imagine Emily. She earns $60,000 a year. During a period of high inflation, groceries become more expensive, rent goes up, car insurance jumps, electricity costs more. A year later, her employer gives her a 4% raise. Technically, she's making more money, but if her living expenses climbed much faster before that raise arrived, she's actually worse off than she was before. On paper, Emily got richer. In reality, her money simply became smaller. And that's the part inflation statistics can never fully capture. Because people don't remember inflation rates. They remember what things used to cost. Now here's where the story becomes strange. If rising prices frustrate almost everyone, why don't governments simply aim for zero inflation? Problem solved, right? Not quite. Imagine you're planning to buy a new washing machine. It costs $800 today. You know it'll probably cost around $820 next year. Nothing dramatic, just a little more. So what do? You buy it today. Multiply that decision by millions of households. Suddenly, factories stay busy. Delivery companies stay busy. Retail workers stay busy. Manufacturers invest in new equipment. Businesses hire more employees because customers keep showing up. The economy keeps moving. Now flip the situation. Suppose everyone believes prices will be lower next year. Why buy today? Why buy a car this month? If waiting 6 months saves you thousands, why replace your television if it'll almost certainly be cheaper later? One person waiting doesn't matter. Millions of people waiting changes everything. Sales begin to slow. Companies postpone investments. Hiring freezes. Some businesses cut jobs. Those newly unemployed workers spend less. Other businesses lose customers. And before long, waiting itself becomes contagious. This is why economists pay so much attention to expectations. Not because they can predict the future perfectly, but because what people believe about tomorrow often changes what they do today. It's a strange feedback loop. Expect higher prices, and people accelerate the economy. Expect lower prices, and they accidentally hit the brakes. That's why most central banks don't chase perfect price stability. Instead, they aim for something slightly imperfect. A small amount of inflation, usually around 2%. Not because they enjoy making your groceries more expensive, but because they believe a slowly moving economy is healthier than one standing completely still. Whether they're always right is a very different question. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, I get it. But why not just let prices slowly fall? Wouldn't everyone be happier? It sounds perfectly reasonable until you follow the consequences. Imagine you're shopping for a new laptop. Today, it costs $1,000, but everyone believes it'll cost $900 in 6 months. So, you wait. After all, why spend more if waiting costs nothing? Now imagine millions of people making that exact same decision. Stores sell fewer laptops. Manufacturers receive fewer orders. Factories slow production. Profits shrink. Hiring stops. Some companies begin laying people off. Now those workers have even less money to spend. Demand falls further. Businesses respond by cutting prices again, which convinces even more people to keep waiting. This is where it breaks. The economy enters what we could call the waiting economy. Nobody is panicking. Nobody is rushing. Everyone is simply postponing. Consumers postpone purchases. Businesses postpone investments. Banks postpone lending. Employers postpone hiring. Each decision makes perfect sense on its own. Together, they quietly suffocate economic activity. That's why deflation can become surprisingly difficult to escape, because falling prices change behavior, and behavior changes the economy. History has shown this more than once. During severe deflationary periods, economies have struggled with years of weak growth, falling demand, and stubborn unemployment. It's one reason policymakers tend to fear deflation almost as much as runaway inflation. which feels deeply unfair. When prices rise, people complain. When prices fall, economists complain. Welcome to macroeconomics. Nobody leaves completely satisfied. So what happens when inflation becomes too high? Governments don't usually set prices. They don't call every supermarket and demand cheaper bread. Instead, they rely on one institution, the central bank, and its favorite weapon, interest rates. Here's the basic idea. When borrowing money is cheap, people borrow more. Families finance cars. Businesses expand factories. Investors fund new projects. More money moves through the economy. But when inflation starts running too hot, central banks try to slow everything down. They raise interest rates. Suddenly, that new mortgage becomes more expensive. Business loans cost more. Credit card debt becomes painful. People borrow less. Businesses invest less. Consumers spend less. Demand begins to cool. And eventually, price increases begin to slow as well. Simple enough? Except there's a catch. Actually, there are millions of them, because every purchase that doesn't happen is also someone's income that disappears. The family that delays buying a car means one less sale for the dealership, which means fewer commissions, which means less money spent elsewhere. The company that cancels a factory expansion also cancels construction contracts, equipment orders, new jobs. The medicine works, but it has side effects. That's why central banks face one of the hardest jobs in economics. Raise rates too slowly, and inflation can become embedded. Raise them too aggressively, and you risk pushing the economy into recession. It's less like flipping a switch and more like adjusting the temperature of an enormous building. Turn the dial, then wait, sometimes for months, sometimes longer. Only then do you discover whether you made the room comfortable or accidentally froze everyone inside it. There's one last piece of the puzzle, and it's the reason so many people feel like the economy they're living in has nothing to do with the one they hear about on the news. Every month, headlines announce the latest inflation number: 3%, 4%, 2.5%. It sounds incredibly precise, as if inflation were the same experience for everyone, but it isn't. Inflation is an average, and nobody actually lives an average life. Imagine two neighbors. The first is a retired homeowner. She paid off her mortgage years ago. She rarely drives. Her biggest expenses are groceries, utilities, and the occasional vacation. Now look next door, a young couple. They're renting, they have 2 children, they commute every day. They're paying for childcare, fuel, insurance, and hoping, somehow, to save for their first home. Now imagine food prices jump. Gasoline becomes more expensive. Rent increases. Childcare costs climb again. Who feels that inflation more? Both families live on the same street. Both shop at the same supermarket. Both hear the exact same inflation report. But they are living in completely different economies. That's because inflation doesn't just depend on how much prices rise. It depends on which prices rise. If luxury watches become 20% cheaper, most people won't notice. But if bread, electricity, or rent rises by just a few percent, millions of households feel it immediately. That's why inflation often feels worse than the official number suggests. Because the things we buy most often are also the things we remember most clearly. Your brain doesn't build its own inflation index. It remembers moments. The first time you paid twice as much for butter. The rent increase that forced you to rethink your budget. The restaurant you quietly stopped visiting because it had become too expensive. Those memories stay with you, long after inflation itself has slowed, and perhaps that's the biggest lesson of all. Inflation isn't just an economic statistic, it's a psychological one. People don't judge the economy by reading charts. They judge it every time they open their wallet. And that's why governments can honestly report that inflation is falling, while millions of people honestly feel like nothing has improved. Both can be true at the same time. If you enjoy understanding global chaos, In slightly less chaotic ways, you know what to do. Now, let's keep going. So, why can't prices just stay the same? Because an economy isn't a museum, it's a living system. Every single day, millions of people make decisions. Someone starts a business, someone buys a house, someone asks for a raise, someone retires, someone invents a better product, someone else goes bankrupt. Prices are constantly trying to reflect all of those decisions at once. Trying to freeze them would be like trying to freeze the ocean. It might look calm for a moment, but underneath, the pressure keeps building. That's why central banks don't actually aim for perfect price stability. They aim for predictable change. Just enough inflation to encourage spending and investment, but not so much that money rapidly loses its value. It's an imperfect solution, because every alternative is imperfect too. High inflation quietly steals purchasing power. Deflation quietly steals confidence. Higher interest rates cool prices, but they can also cool hiring. Lower interest rates stimulate growth until they stimulate too much of it. There is no magic setting. No hidden button policymakers refuse to press. Only trade-offs. And that's probably the most uncomfortable truth in economics. Most economic debates aren't about choosing between a good option and a bad one. They're about choosing which problem you're more willing to live with. Because every solution creates a new problem, just a different one. If there's one lesson to take away from all of this, it's this. Inflation isn't simply the story of prices going up. It's the story of an economy trying, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to balance growth, stability, employment, and confidence all at the same time. It's messy, it's frustrating, and occasionally, it feels completely unfair. But understanding why it happens is the first step towards seeing the economy for what it really is. Not a machine that can be perfectly controlled, but a system that's constantly adjusting to millions of human decisions happening every single day. So here's a question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. If you had the power to redesign the economy, would you choose a world where prices slowly rise every year, or one where prices almost never change, but recessions become far more frequent and unemployment much more common? Because as strange as it sounds, modern economies don't believe they can eliminate inflation. They believe they can only choose how much of it they're willing to live with. And that may be one of the biggest trade-offs hiding in plain sight.